All right, welcome back everyone. Our next speaker is Professor Richard Werner. Richard Werner is an Oxford-educated economist and university professor. Richard began working at the Bank of Japan in 1992 and later worked as chief economist for Jardine Fleming Securities. In 1995, he invented the economic policy quantitative easing. In 1998, he became a senior consultant to the Asian Development Bank, and in 2005, he became a professor of banking and finance in the UK. In 2006, Richard served as a senior managing director at Bear Stearns Asset Management. For more than a decade, Richard was a member of the ECB Shadow Council, and since 2010, he has been involved in the establishment of community banks in the UK and other countries. He is the author of the best-selling book in Japan, Princes of the Yen, and his academic research can be found at professorwerner.org. Please give a warm welcome to our next speaker, Richard Werner.
Thank you, Taylor. And thank you very much. Well, yeah, I'll start here. Thanks to the organizers for having me. It's a pleasure. I have quite a few slides, but I've already found out yesterday that this is a very intelligent audience, so I'm sure we'll be up to the challenge. I was asked to talk about the Great Reset, which is really a technocrat takeover, but it has at its core, despite the whole COVID and health and viral sort of cover, it has a monetary core. And I'd like to talk about that, and you will then see the link. Now, I'm an economist for my sins, and economics at one stage was a very promising discipline, and economists were very optimistic. Now, the most famous economist of the 20th century is John Maynard Keynes, and of course you know how these things work, but there's no doubt, that's what he is. And he wrote, actually it was originally a lecture, and which he wrote up in 1928, Looking Ahead a Century. And we're almost there. There's just a few years missing. Now, in this lecture, it's called Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. He predicted that based on the past performance, where we have significant productivity gains, which lead to income gains, and therefore economic growth, prosperity. Based on his analysis, he predicted that 100 years later, so essentially now, people won't have to work anymore. And when you check his analysis, the shocking thing is not that we're very far removed from that prediction. The shocking thing is just how accurate he was in his calculations. And that is a big puzzle. He calculated the prosperity, the wealth, the incomes generated based on productivity gains. And he probably did not predict the Second World War and various forms of dislocation, which did happen in between, which of course, were a risk to his forecast. But the surprise is that productivity growth and even income growth, even per capita income growth, came in as he predicted. In fact, he had a range. And what we found was, what we're getting is at the upper end of his range of prediction. In other words, the prosperity came true. It has been generated. But we still have to work. So what's gone wrong? What Keynes could not fathom, what he could not imagine is that all this productivity and all this income and all this wealth would be generated, and yet would be so unevenly distributed that a very, very small group would claim it all and keep the rest as working drones. That he could not imagine. But that's what happened. So, we had these wonderful promises by economists, and, well, there have been some setbacks. Now, of course, when you look at the general, the mood in economics, after the Second World War, there was again this mood of optimism. There was good economic growth in the 50s and 60s, and it seemed ordinary people were doing quite well in those decades. So again, expectations were ratcheted up, and then economists were again predicting we will have a lot of prosperity in the coming decades. We've already seen from Keynes that this is not unreasonable. And I think we have to remind ourselves sometimes when we face all these bad things that are happening and bad policies leading to bad results, that actually the potential is there. Our problems, as JFK said, are man-made, therefore they may be solved by man. And man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. And I believe that's true. We have to put our minds to it. Now let's start with one problem that we're currently facing, which is inflation. After the 50s and 60s of optimism, there was another big setback, and that was the 1970s, a decade of high inflation and not high economic growth, stagnation. So this is called stagflation. If you look at the figures, the CPI, Consumer Price Index, rose in the US by only actually 13.5%. I mean, if you look at it from the present perspective, then well, we're not very far removed from these figures. That was the peak of the inflation in the US. Of course, it varied across countries. Germany did even better, 7% in 73 was the highest in the 70s. Japan and the UK had much higher inflation rates, 23, 24%. So it varied. Now, why did it vary? And in fact, why the inflation? And why do we have inflation now? Well, let's get to the bottom of that. We were told in the 70s that this inflation has been due to a war in the Middle East, which resulted in sanctions and oil embargoes, and therefore oil shocks, and therefore also price shocks. That's the story. Now, all that started in October 73. Before, there was no war, there were no sanctions, there was no oil embargo, right? And because of that, we're told, and even now, that's what the historians claim, that's why we had this inflation. And today we're told our current inflation is due to a war, external events, energy price shock, and so on. That's what the Federal Reserve, what ECB are claiming. That's why we have inflation. Well, let's check what happened in the 70s. Oh, and by the way, having analyzed the 70s inflation, the ECB, when it was newly created, promised us, oh, this is not going to happen again. We're much better prepared, and there won't be such a thing anymore. But it's much worse than that, as you'll find out. So this adverse supply shock, we were told, is the reason why the predictions of continued prosperity didn't come true. And sorry, but you have to scale back your expectations, tighten your belts. In fact, in the early 70s, we had Soviet-style rationing. Energy had to be rationed. There were days on which you couldn't drive your car, and depending on your number plate, depending on the country, you know, today cars with even number plates are allowed to drive, and tomorrow with the odd numbers. Things like that were introduced in the 70s in Europe. And we were told it was because of this energy supply shock. Is that really true? And to answer that question, we need to have a very quick crash course in how the economy really works. And I'll quickly tell you about the secrets of the banking trade and the rules of the money game. Let's start with one thing that all economists can agree, because famously they all have their own theories and they all disagree and are constantly arguing. We've got all these schools of thought certainly in English language economics. These are the major schools of thought from David Ricardo in the 19th century. Classical economics, new classical economics, Alfred Marshall, Keynesian, then monetarist, new classical, neo-Wickselian, post-Keynesian, Austrian, ecological economics. Now they all agree on one thing. If you lower interest rates, you get higher economic growth. And if you raise interest rates, you get slower growth. And I'm sure you've heard this before. Has anyone heard this before, this claim? Yeah? I mean, they're saying it daily. The newspapers regurgitate it daily for the last several decades. So I call this the law and the profit of equilibrium economics. Because actually, these are all the different schools of thought of equilibrium economics. I'll come to that. That's what they say. Lower rates lead to higher growth. Higher rates lead to lower growth. And by the way, that's why now they're saying we have to raise rates because we have to fight inflation. But already, watch out, they've already tricked you. Because they're saying, oh, this inflation is not due to monetary policy, but we're going to end it with monetary policy. Right? How's that going to work? But let's check this. Because of course this claim has been made for the last 200 and 250 years in economics and is taught at all the international universities across the globe and is reiterated daily by policymakers, central banks and so on. So of course we can assume, and we've got a lot of scientists here in the room, that it's well established in peer-reviewed journals, and there's thousands of articles that have established this. So perhaps recently maybe they haven't checked it too much, but because it's just so well established, right? Well, actually, how many academic papers demonstrating this are there? What do you think? How many empirical studies are there that demonstrate this one claim that all the different schools of equilibrium economics agree on? What do you think? I mean, is it in the tens of thousands or only in the thousands? Or hundreds? It is zero. There is not a single paper empirically demonstrating this. So I thought, okay, well, it's one of the taboo topics, but it's so fundamental in economics. Let's just have some empirical research on this. I mean, I'm always a great defender of the idea that we should use scientific research methods also in economics. It's a radical idea, but so we did this study together with a very good econometrician, Kang-Suk Lee, who's at the Luxembourg Central Bank. Published now, the second paper has just come out this year. In the first one we had US, Japan, Germany and the UK for half a century, and in the second one with 19 countries, high frequency. And the conclusion is, this claim that the correlation between interest rates and growth is negative. Higher rates, lower growth, lower rates, higher growth. And the causation is from rates to growth. Interest rates affect growth. So these are two claims, correlation and causation. And we found that it's not true. Both cannot be confirmed. In fact, they have been rejected empirically. These hypotheses have been falsified, rejected. You look at the scatter plot on the left, the upper one is Japanese data, interest rates, short rates and economic growth, and in the US, long rates and economic growth. It's clearly a positive correlation. But you could say, well, that's because of timing, leads and lags. Of course, in the study, we very carefully control for that. It's a dynamic conditional correlation analysis in a gauge model. But you can also see it by simply looking at the timing at the right side, the time series, and you find that for example, in Japan, the top right graph, the pink line is GDP growth, jumps up in 87, and interest rates only start to rise 2 years later, 2.5 years later. Then GDP peaks and starts to fall in 89, and interest rates come later. Now you think, well, that's the central bank, these are short rates, but surely the US Treasury market, the most liquid securities market in the world, is different. They're much more ahead of the curve, are they? Well, look at the graph, bottom right. And you see that, for example, in the 80s, economic growth first accelerated, and then, sometimes a year later, interest rates rose. Then growth decelerated, and a year later, rates started to fall. So what we find is that, while the official story is high rates lead to low growth, low rates lead to high growth, the empirical reality is high growth leads to high rates, low growth leads to low rates. So this is the opposite of what they tell you. in both dimensions. Interest rates are the result of economic growth and can't be the cause, and therefore they also can't be a tool of monetary policy. That raises a number of questions, I'd say. Like, what have these economists been talking about for 250 years? It also raises the question, well, okay, what is driving economic growth? And why do central banks keep up this charade? So here we are now, today, 2022. Inflation is not due to monetary policy, but monetary policy raising rates will now end inflation. The inflation is due to the oil shock, energy prices, we're being told by the ECB, but now higher rates will solve the problem. So the interest rate thesis has been soundly rejected, and central bankers have sometimes come out admitting this. I like this quote from Dame Kate Barker, who was on the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, and she admitted, I've come to wonder about my time at the Monetary Policy Committee setting interest rates. I mean, that's all they did, right? Sit around the table, and then, shall we raise rates by 0.25% today, or shall we just keep them unchanged? You know, in the hours passing, you know, and hectic life. She says, it's been a bit of a waste of time, really. Well, yeah, any statisticians could have told her that. But where does this idea come from that we seem to have accepted against the empirical evidence that interest rates are the key variable driving the economy? It comes from equilibrium, the idea of equilibrium. And where did the idea of equilibrium come from? Because you see, in equilibrium, prices are key because they move so that demand and supply is equal, which is called equilibrium. Therefore, prices are key, and the overall most important price is the price of money, the interest rate. That's where it comes from. And here it is. And this is, now some of you may not have got a degree in economics. Hands up, who does not have a degree in economics? Thank you very much. Okay, well, don't worry. We'll cover this in 2 minutes now. You will find out the one and only tool used in economics for everything. And here it is. It's this diagram in price quantity space, used for any market. It can be the market for BMWs, or it can be the labor market in the Netherlands, or it can be the euro US dollar exchange rate. You know, any market. And we have a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve. And because it's price quantity space, it's prices that move, because you see, if prices are too high, then there will be excess supply. People can't sell their stuff. And then they will start to say, well, it's getting old, maybe we have to reduce the price. So then the price comes down until it's the right price. Demand equals supply. If prices are too low, then there's excess demand, and the people selling the stuff will realize, hey, we can raise prices. So therefore, prices move to give us equilibrium. That's quite convincing, isn't it? It's quite an elegant little concept. And that's why, of course, it has been convincing a lot of people. But read the small print. It's like in your mobile phone contract, or in fact, nowadays, anything you do on your phone or a web page, you have to actually confirm that you've read all the terms and conditions. 15 pages. Are they forcing us to lie several times every day? Wow, it's a sad story, isn't it? Well, this is the small print. What is the small print here? The small print is, this is true if, and only if, at least 8, and these are the core, I mean there's more, but let's just focus on these 8 assumptions hold. Namely, perfect information, everyone knows everything, perfectly informed. Complete markets for everything. Perfect competition, that means there's so many companies that corporate profits are always zero because they're always competing away the profit. Literally, that is the definition of perfect competition. So next time when the industry analysts tell you corporate results are out, the profits are out, oh, they're again zero, everywhere. You remember, right? Every quarter we have this announcement, isn't it? Profits always. Instantaneous price adjustments. So in the supermarkets, they can't have fixed prices. It's all digital because every second they're changing, right? Zero transaction costs. It's not costly to undertake any transaction. No time constraints. Usually, students are told this sort of stuff, and there seems to be a bit of an audience. They just don't realize once they get a job, they get very busy. Profit maximization by rational agents. Now, that definition is very loaded. There's actually several sub-assumptions there. This means you only care about money and what they call utility maximization, your satisfaction, and only your own. You never care about anyone else. Nobody is influenced in any way by the actions of others. These are the 8 assumptions. Now, if they all hold at the same time, then we can expect that we get equilibrium. That's what economics has demonstrated. In fact, it's probably a good follow-on, since Popper was mentioned by William, to talk a little bit about methodology. Now, most people think economics, and they call it economic science even. There's a prize in honor of Alfred Nobel in economic sciences, which actually is from the Swedish Central Bank. So it should be called the Swedish Central Bank Prize in Economic Sciences. But anyway, they call it an economic science. Now, what is the research methodology used in the sciences? Well, there's actually 2 approaches. One is the inductive approach, and one is the deductive approach. The inductive approach is characterized by the inference of general laws from particular instances. The deductive method, or axiomatic method, is, and you already see that, well, that definition is quite a bit longer, should make you suspicious. In logic, the procedure by which an entire science or system of theorems is deduced in accordance with specified rules by logical deduction from certain basic propositions called axioms. And now it gets really concerning, which in turn are constructed from a few terms taken as primitive. These terms may be either arbitrarily defined, did you hear that? Arbitrarily defined, or conceived according to a model in which some intuitive warrant for their truth is felt to exist. Intuition, feeling, wow, it sounds pretty scientific to me. Okay, so we've got these 2 methods. Now, how do scientists work? And we've got plenty of scientists here, and I'm sure they will confirm that they look at the data, look at the facts, data. So careful observation of phenomena. Then you analyze the data, you organize the material, and as you do that, you naturally see some patterns. And that often gives you an idea, well, maybe if this happens, always this happens, well, maybe there's a link. Well, we have to test. So you develop hypotheses from observing the data, and then you can use the Popperian approach. You either reject them or you fail to reject, which is the strongest evidence you'd ever get that you fail to reject. That is the scientific approach, and that is the inductive methodology. Now, what is the methodology used in economics? It's the deductive method, surprise, surprise. So, remember, intuition, feelings, axioms. So, here's the axiom that economics is built on, and I'm talking about English language, mainstream economics, these schools of thought that you saw. Equilibrium economics. Individuals are rational, selfish, autistic. There's no social relationships. They don't care about others. Of course, if this was true, the planet would be empty because we all would have died as babies. Because they can't look after themselves, so you need somebody else. But this is assumed not to happen. Everyone looks after themselves. That's the axiom. Now, an axiom is something we know to be true for sure. And that's convenient because then we never have to check whether it is true and actually it's not true. That's an axiom. Now, then, based on this axiom, we then build by making assumptions that we admit are not true. Such as perfect information, complete markets, price adjustment, 0 transaction cost. Infinite lives is usually also one of them. Okay. So that's the deductive method used in economics. So in other words, we've constructed a theoretical dream world in which markets are optimal because it is a theoretical dream world. And we've defined it such that markets are always efficient and optimized. Any intervention, such as by a policymaker to change things for the better, what they think needs to be done, well, that's not needed because it's already optimal in this theoretical dream world. So that's why they usually say we need to deregulate, liberalize, and privatize. Government intervention, it's just distorting things because it's, the economy is optimal left on its own, which essentially, big business likes because then they don't get any obstacles. Developing countries are told you need to deregulate, liberalize, open up to free trade. You shouldn't have policies, industrial policies to build up your economy, when actually there's no economy in the world that has developed according to that advice, but that doesn't stop economists. Now, Popper recognized that followers of a particular school of thought may want to defend their theory, their pet theory, and adopt immunizing stratagems to guard their theories against being falsified. And when you look at different theories, you should always be careful, because one that cannot be tested is then not a good theory. That's one of the principles. There is also the other danger of so-called reverse engineering, which is, what do we want to prove? You start with the question that you want to prove. And just for sake of argument, imagine this scenario where there's some very big corporations and some very big banks. They say, wouldn't it be convenient if we could have the argument that there should be no restrictions on what we, the big banks and big businesses, are doing? What can we do to get that result? Well, let's have some objective scientific studies on this topic, and we're funding it. And of course, if you're a badly paid academic, this will be very tempting. And you're sort of trying to find out what's the sponsor wanting to hear. So imagine this scenario where you start with your preferred conclusion, such as markets are optimal and efficient, and any intervention and government rules should be abolished. That's the conclusion. So now you work backwards. What sort of model will give us this conclusion? Then, what sort of assumptions do we need to justify this model, and what axioms to present that entire package? And then comes the most important step: present in reverse order. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got adults in the room here. The world is a tough place. Now, we've got to model this, so we've got to make some simplifying assumptions, but people are looking after themselves, aren't they? People are pretty sort of profit-oriented. So here's our assumptions: profit maximization, there's tough competition out there. We've got the internet, perfect information. Now we've got this model here, and we can manipulate. Here's the result. Markets are optimal. We need deregulation, liberalization, and privatization. Well, who would have thought that? Well, if this model says this, then we've got to do it. Now, of course, this would be rather less than scientific. I suppose one could call it charlatanism. And, of course, it's always important to have the common sense check. Anyone recognize this picture?
Alice in Wonderland.
Yes, Alice in Wonderland. Led by the hand of the Queen in Wonderland. And they've got a nice little conversation going there about things that are hard to believe. So Alice says, "There's no use trying. One can't believe impossible things." The Queen responds, "I dare say you haven't had much practice. When I was your age, I always did it, practice to believe impossible things, for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." But what we learned here is that certainly not Alice, but not even the Queen in Wonderland would qualify as economists, because they don't believe enough impossible things. It's not good enough, even for the Queen, to just believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. You've got to believe at least 8 impossible things all the time. So even if we give the economists the benefit of the doubt, and they love to present mathematical calculations, let's use probability. Let's say there's the probability of any one of these assumptions to come true is high, is more than 50%. It's more likely to be true than not. So we really helping them, giving them a bit benefit of the doubt here. Even in this scenario, say 55% that each assumption is true. What they seem to have forgotten, despite their maths fetish, is they haven't done their maths right. Because 8 of these assumptions have to be true at the same time. And what is the probability? Even with each being true, a probability of being true of 55%, of all 8 being true at the same time, it's 0.55 to the power of 8, which is less than 1%. So what do we conclude from this? Because really, frankly, the probability of having complete markets, perfect competition, perfect information, is somewhat less than 55%. I think it's around 0. Therefore, we know markets cannot be expected to clear, and demand cannot be expected to be equal to supply. The reality and the real economy out there works differently. Markets can only be expected to be in disequilibrium, and that means markets are rationed. When markets are rationed and demand is not equal to supply, what happens then? Actually, it's very simple. The short side principle applies. Whichever quantity of demand or supply is smaller determines the outcome, and a new dimension enters the analysis. Power. Power. Now that, of course, is the main reason why they love to talk about only equilibrium. And you may not be aware, but I would say 98, maybe 99% of economics books are about equilibrium. They assume equilibrium, literally. You can throw them all out. It's not about reality. It's very clever stuff. It's about a fictional planet that must be very far away from this one, and that may or may not exist. And some people may want to spend their lifetime, writing works about this fictional planet. But others are more interested in what happens on this planet, and then these books are entirely useless. Because on this planet, markets are rationed. And in rationed markets, the short side has power. Now in equilibrium, there's no discussion about power. Oh, you're unemployed. Oh, sorry, that's the market outcome. Too bad. The short side has the power to pick and choose with who to do business. Now that may be demand, it may be supply, that may vary depending on the market. It's perhaps most obvious in the labor market. When you apply, there is more likely to be more than one applicant. And how's that decision made? They're not going to ask you what's the lowest salary you're willing to work for. Instead, the salary is more or less fixed. But they're going to pick and choose who they're going to hire, and what is that based on? These are so-called non-market criteria. Usually the short side will try to extract something, because these are decision makers. I once tried to raise money for my global macro fund, and the fund manager goes, we've completed the due diligence. Congratulations, not many funds like yours pass this due diligence process. We can now invest with you. And I think, well, that's great. I mean, I was young and naive. That's great, fantastic. And silence. Then he says, we can now invest with you. That's fantastic. Okay, all right. What should we do next? Silence. Later I realized, and they didn't invest, by the way. Later I realized I should have said, how can I make this decision easier for you? What is your Swiss bank account number? So the short side picks and chooses and extracts something. Just think about how in the labor market the hiring is done when the job is very easy but very well paid. How does that happen? Is that a market result? Well, there's never an equilibrium result. Think of Hollywood, Me Too. So that's how the world works. Well, let's apply that to money. How is the market for money decided? Which is larger, the demand for money or the supply of money? Well, nowadays you may wonder, but in general, I think we could be fairly confident that, in fact, I will claim the blame for myself. When I was a student already at the LSE, they said, this is the money demand function. I thought, that can't be true. So, horizontal addition of each individual's money demand. Well, my money demand is infinite. That makes the money demand also infinite, just because of me. It's true. So, of course, in reality, the demand for money is always larger, because money is so useful, maybe for philanthropic projects. Whatever, it is pretty useful in our society, in our system. So the supply is the short side, the supply of money. And remember, the short side has power, the power to pick and choose. Okay, I have to drastically speed up now. So the hidden power dimension becomes visible, and the money is supplied by who? What do you think? It's supplied by banks. Economists say that banks are deposit-taking institutions that lend money. The truth in economics is almost always the opposite of what they tell you. The truth is, and you can confirm this in law, banks don't take deposits and banks don't lend money. It's true, and I've demonstrated that. We can't go into details because I'm out of time, but the money supply is created by banks as they invent money newly from scratch, and some of you may have heard about this. This used to be very much suppressed information, and when I first published about this in 91, you get called all sorts of names, but by now it's become very established, although still it is not yet admitted mainstream opinion. So the bank purchases the loan contract, which is an IOU. The bank's in the business of purchasing securities. Bank deposits don't exist, they're loans to the bank. So as the bank purchases your loan contract, it now owes you money, which means there's a record created for the debt it owes you, which is called the bank deposit, and that is newly created out of nothing. Sorry, that was a bit quick, but we're out of time. But once you realize that the money is created out of nothing by the banking system, you realize there is a world of abundance. We can solve all these problems. We don't need to have unemployment. We don't need to have business cycles. We can solve all these problems. Countries can develop very quickly. We don't need to have boom-bust cycles. We don't need to have inflation either, because the system works very easily. I mean, money is created through bank credit. It's called credit creation, call it C. Credit can go into the GDP circulation or non-GDP asset circulation. And we get three scenarios. If it's used for asset purchases, you get asset inflation. These booms that are usually followed by busts, because it's a Ponzi scheme. The bank's creating money, pushing up asset prices. This will continue while they continue, and as long as they continue to create money and push up asset prices. Once that stops, asset prices come down, the late-coming investors will go bankrupt, and the banks will start with non-performing loans, then reduce the lending, then asset prices come down further, you get a downward spiral, banking system goes past, the economy is going to big recession because banks don't even lend to the real economy. It's always the same, has been played hundreds of times, just in the last 60 years, 100 instances in the world, always the same game. Now, when credit creation is used for consumption, you get consumer price inflation. That's what happened since March 2020, so I warned this is going to lead to inflation. When they did it in 2008, they did it differently. It went to asset markets, and we did not get inflation, as I also warned early on. The redeeming feature of the banking system is this green box. This is bank credit creation for business investment to implement new technologies, increase productivity, and that creates economic growth and jobs, and can be done at any moment and in any situation. It's always non-inflationary. You can even do it full employment. You can still have higher economic growth. Growth is just a statistical accounting fiction, which is also why it can't hurt the environment. You know, how can statistical fictions hurt the environment? Pollution hurts the environment, and you can have pollution when you have zero growth or negative growth. So the argument that growth is the enemy is wrong, but currently the technocrats and central planners, they want to reduce growth, so they are demonizing growth. And that's why they make this argument. So we've got the sustainable form of credit creation, and we've got the unsustainable form, which will lead to always the predictable disasters. Asset price bubbles like in Japan in the 80s, massive credit creation, then 20 years of recession. They could have ended it, of course, but it was a policy decision by the Bank of Japan not to end it and extend the recession. Now I need to solve that puzzle of the inflation in the 70s. Now that we've got this crash course done, we can very quickly actually now come to the conclusion. And perhaps I get 2 extra minutes or so for the conclusion. So what created the 70s inflation was actually not this oil shock, but the money creation in the banking system under the policies of the Federal Reserve. You see, bank credit creation was already booming in 71 and 72, peaking in March 73, 16.4% in the US. That caused the inflation shock 1.5 years later. And the same is true for other countries. You know, look at Germany, 14% growth, creating the inflation later, and this was in 73. Japan peaked in 72. This is well before the oil embargo, OPEC, and all that story. And the same, of course, is true for the current inflation. I want in 2020 we'll get this inflation 1.5 years later, because unlike the 2008 policy, which did not create money for general consumption spending, only asset inflation, since 2020 they increased credit creation for general spending and consumption, and that leads to the predictable result of inflation. So big difference. Here are the top 7 claims by central bank economists that are false. Interest rates drive the economy and are negatively correlated. Of course, you know the true story already. They're positively correlated and follow growth. Banks are not financial intermediaries, they create money. Markets are not in equilibrium, they're rationed. For economic growth, we don't first need savings. We actually create the money through the banking system. That's how successfully in high growth economies operate. People don't care about their own satisfaction, they care about other people, and they're very much influenced by others. That's why we have these huge advertising bubbles, budgets in Google and other companies. You know, if the assumptions of the economists were true, Google wouldn't exist. And of course, the policies applied to developing countries are also entirely false. No country has moved from developing country status to developed country status based on the IMF World Bank policies of deregulation, liberalization, privatization. Financial crises, inflation, and business cycles are not random shocks, as the central bankers tell us. They're created by central bank policies, as you may have guessed by now. Of course, you shouldn't be surprised by this lack of knowledge and disinformation. In fact, economics was the first discipline where they tried for decades already what is now happening in other disciplines, including, you know, natural sciences, medicine, health sciences. And of course, the suppression of dissent has been well practiced in economics. So let me now conclude. You know, official truth is not actual truth, as Lord Acton already pointed out. How have the central planners reacted to these revelations? Because this is becoming now demonstrated in peer-reviewed journals, which was difficult, but it's happening. They responded by pushing rates to zero, which has been bankrupting a lot of banks, imposing a lot of bank regulations, particularly in the Eurozone, to centralize the banking system. ECB says there's too many banks. Which country do they mean? This is the one sticking out is Germany with 1,800 banks. Well, the goal is to reduce that to just a handful of banks. They've done it in the Netherlands. The central bank forcibly merged 120 credit unions, cooperative banks, into one a few years back. But this is happening elsewhere. The abolition of cash, of course, is the other goal, so that in the end we only have digital currency left. And they, of course, want to, on the one hand, reform even the banking system to abolish the power of banks to create money. Now that the knowledge is out, we can create our community banks, you see. That is why suddenly it's saying, oh, we've just discovered banks create money. Well, we've got to abolish that. And so there's this movement to abolish bank credit creation, have sort of sovereign money, government money, which means the central bankers will be in control. The other way of getting that is through central bank digital currency, because that means the central bank is now going to compete against the banks, the regulator competing against the regulator. Is that fair competition? The umpire in the football game saying, I'm going to score some goals. And you guys are getting red cards, by the way. So the central bank will offer retail current accounts at the central bank. And then you create a bit of a shock and a crisis, all the money goes to the central bank, the banks are shut down. That's of course the goal, to end up in the Soviet Union with one bank, mono banking. In fact, the shortcut to whatever they're doing is actually to, you know, remember what happened in the Soviet Union. They seem to love the Soviet system. I mean, it's not by coincidence that the European Commission is modeled on the Politburo. And the Soviet Union, there was a parliament, but they just didn't have the right to table any laws. That came from the Politburo. Oh, sounds very much like the European Parliament. They have no right to table any laws. So the central banks aim at this Orwellian dystopia of total control, And the central bank digital currency will enable them to monitor all your transactions and switch you off, and switch your power to purchase anything off. And also, you'll be very selective. Maybe you'll be allowed to buy this, but not that. Oh, this is too far from your home. You can't buy there. Anything is possible with this digital control tool. Of course, there's a big hurdle now, because they never tell you how is that actually going to work in practice. The intermediate step is to have it on your mobile phone, but really the goal is to have it implanted under your skin. And there's a hurdle. This is a big, imposition and violation of human dignity. So there's resistance. And that's where universal basic income comes in, which is an old idea, a century old. Why are the elites that so far ignored this idea as being sort of somewhat communist, why are they now all endorsing it? All the billionaires are coming, we need universal basic income. And then even in 2017, when the technology was there, the microchip technology, Bill Gates said, it's too early to have universal basic income. Well, because digital IDs hadn't been introduced yet. And that's, of course, where the whole COVID story comes in. Now, thanks to COVID, the EU and others have adopted the COVID vaccination passport certificates to be extended until 2023, they've recently decided. And it seems that the Swedes, which are always good for these social experiments, it seems, have increased the microchip implantation process because it's going to be unified with the vaccine passport, which of course is less the currency than a monitoring, surveying, and total control tool. The overarching trend of the 20th century has been concentration of power in the hands of the few. That's what we have to work against and fight against. And we have to do the opposite. We need to work against the centralization and introduce decentralization. I think because money is at the core of their plans, we should also respond with a monetary response among other responses. Namely, we should work hard to decentralize the banking systems and create new community banks. Funded by the community. It's not that expensive to set up a community bank. And that means we have our own local central bank that creates money for that community, only lends locally, and is accountable to the community. Any organization that's too large, and that happens very soon in terms of the number of decision makers in an organization, becomes unaccountable. So small is beautiful. We need small, accountable local community banks and reoriented economy towards community sources, and that is a way of fighting against this. The cooperative movement is an important one that will also fight against the centralization. We have to support it. To be careful, there's lots of controlled opposition at the now very large associations governing this, whether it's the farmers or the cooperative banks. That's of course a big problem, but from the grassroots direction, I think we can fight against that. So setting up community banks is a way to do this, and also make sure there's lots of job creation. I think I've mentioned a lot of the other stuff. Thanks very much.
All right, Professor Richard Werner, thank you for that presentation on centralization and also for providing solutions. It's very important that we do have discussions about how we can get out of the system and also create a better future for ourselves and our loved ones. We are a bit pressed for time, so I doubt that we will be able to open it up for audience questions, but please know that you can approach the speakers at any time during a break if you would like to ask them a question perhaps. But now I do want to go to our panel. We are joined by Mads Palsvig, Peter Sturman, and Willem Engel. I'll just go straight in line. I'll start with you, Mads. Any questions for Professor Richard Werner, or comments or thoughts that you have?
Yes, definitely. Richard, I particularly liked your explanation about Maynard Keynes being right about how abundant this world is and how this is distributed unfairly. Do you have any suggestions how we can mitigate that? How can we get to a point where the trillionaires are not always winning, and actually we can remove poverty like Keynes predicted?
The biggest source of the power of the oligarchs is the banking system, and the biggest source of greater equality in more egalitarian societies is also the banking system, namely when it is very decentralized. The countries with a larger number of small local banks will feature less inequality. Key examples are Germany, Japan, China. And China is a key example because it happened in only 40 years. They started out with one central bank and no other banks. And now they've got the second largest number of banks, almost 5,000 banks. And that's not only created a lot of growth, but also local prosperity that's been totally unseen, unimaginable in a very, very short time period. And essentially by having a cooperative banking system, of course you can combine that then also with corporate, it's combined with voting and can be also introduced on the political level, greater autonomy on the local level. These are solutions to avoid the problems of centralization of power and inequality. Any centralized solution is by definition really not addressing the problem. The centralization goes with inequality. It's the few deciding for the many, and surprise, surprise, is good for them.
Thank you. Peter Sturman?
What I would like to ask is there a future for money? And to be more specific, if these people who desire this great reset with its centralized monetary power in the central banks and the digital currencies are successful, will money still be money? Will it still fit the definition of money that we're used to? Or will it be something completely different?
Yeah, exactly. I think the goal is to have this retail CBDC, which is not really money anymore, because you lose control over your purchasing power, your spending. It's subject to the decrees of the central planners, and when you fit in and you make the right decisions, that's okay, but anything outside their prescribed scope will not be possible. So it is not anymore money in the normal sense.
Just an instrument of power.
It is a control tool. And that's why we have to be against it. It seems that the resistance that some have put up, and I certainly have tried my best since, the last decade to argue against that. Of course, when, 7 years ago you talk about the introduction of a central bank digital currency in a microchip implant, of course you're called, all sorts of names. But it's not the guys that have these ridiculous assumptions that are the conspiracy theorists. No, it's the ones that talk about what actually happens in reality. And so it seems that in response to that, just 2 months ago, there's been an indication that the central planners have decided, okay, we have to slow this down a bit. And it seems that in Europe, they've decided to first move with what's called a wholesale CBDC, which is the central bank digital currencies introduced only via the banking system and therefore will not, at least at this stage, hurt the banks. But of course it's the thin edge of a wedge, because they can quickly then, at some stage when they decide to switch to retail, from wholesale to retail CBDC, and then the banking system will be would be at risk immediately. So that's why it's better not to have the CBDC. I mean, it's a misnomer, and they try to make it sound new when we've been using digital bank currency for many decades. That's our bank transfers, and most of the money supply is bank digital currency, BDC. And they fail to explain that, and then they're selling their central bank current accounts and this CBDC as something new, when really it's about power, and they want to usurp that power, because they figured out now that more and more people realize banks create money. They could actually set up in their local community a bank which will support their community and lead to tremendous prosperity. And many people have done that. But they want to stop that. So now they're saying, oh, no, we can't have that. And this is one of the responses to introduce central bank digital currency. So we have to hold against it. But I think we also have to really work hard to create local banks from scratch.
Well, thank you for the excellent presentation. Chris Martensen from Peak Prosperity, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He shows these graphs that show an almost perfect linear correlation between the availability of energy and the growth of economy. Do you agree with that? And then the second part is, now we see with Ukraine used as a scapegoat, saying that we have a scarcity in energy and that's why we have inflation. So are they turning it around to explain the narrative away?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they're trying to hide the true causes, which is central bank policies, and that's nothing new. They caused this inflation. It was a policy decision that they made unaccountably, without democratic input from anyone, not even governments, not even parliaments. Because the ECB is the most independent and unaccountable central bank in the world. Not in history, because we had this before, when the Reichsbank was, after the First World War, made totally independent from the government and from parliament. There was no German institution that had any influence over the Reichsbank. It was only accountable to the Reparations Committee, which was JP Morgan and was later renamed the BIS in Basel, Bank for International Settlements. So, and the ECB is modeled on that, because the Bundesbank was accountable to Parliament, and that worked really well. So most people think, oh, when they introduced the ECB, they copied the Bundesbank, that was successful, everything fine. And Bundesbank and Nederlands-talige, they have very good reputations, that work well. It's the same thing. No, it's not. As I warned at the time, the lesson that they learned after the Second World War was that the Reichsbank, which was one of the worst central banks in history, was totally unaccountable to anyone, including Parliament. That didn't work. So they made the Bundesbank less independent and accountable to Parliament. Laws were passed to tell them what to do, and that worked really well. But when the ECB was introduced, that was overthrown, and they went back to the Reichsbank. The ECB is not accountable to any democratically elected assembly, and even the attempt to influence the ECB, such as through economic analysis and critique, is illegal according to the Maastricht and Lisbon treaties. And that's the problem. So we have this total unaccountability. So the system, I mean the euro system is a very is a bad system, and led to the predictable results. I warned in 2003 they're going to create boom-bust cycles, asset inflation, banking crises, economic recessions. Then they immediately went out and did that in Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and Greece. This is ECB-induced policy results. Of course, they try to hide that. So they say, oh, it's other things. So whenever a disaster happens, it's never monetary policy. But beforehand, remember, they wanted independence because monetary policy is so important. That's why we need independence. We don't want the politicians to interfere. The technocrats need to be in power. But now that they got all the power, monetary policy is not really very, very influential. It's not very powerful. We have almost no control over this. This is the economy happening. It's a random shock. It's a war happening. And the central bankers, there's almost nothing we can do. They claim now that they have all this power. That's the trouble. So, yeah, they change the narrative as they wish. And it's quite, but maybe to come back to the energy point, very briefly. So, you can have an economic system structured such that economic growth will be one-to-one with energy consumption, but that's a system design, and you can change that design. So there's nothing, is set in stone concerning that. And of course, if you have certain technologies, then in fact, as happened since the 70s, the energy reliance of certain industry goes down. And you can have environmentally very sustainable industries and high growth and reduce your energy consumption. That's possible if that is a policy goal. But so far that wasn't even a policy goal.
All right, thank you. Another round of applause for Professor Richard Werner and our panel. Stay put, please. I just want to provide you with your thanks, Richard.
Welcome, you're watching the International Science Summit in Amsterdam. My name is Tom Switzer, and we do a series of interviews in the studio with the speakers and lecturers who are giving a great number of lectures on COVID, on the 2030 agenda, and so on. Now, today my guest is Richard Werner. Richard Werner in German, Richard Werner in English. What do you prefer?
I don't mind either.
Okay. No. Well,
Richard Werner in Japanese.
Okay, because you lectured as well a couple of years in Japan, in Tokyo, and then went to the UK, where you are a professor now for 18 years. In Japan, you wrote a bestseller on which was actually predicting the financial crisis of 2008 and now. And you're specialized in a lot of very important events coming up, like the CBDCs and the Great Reset in financial economic scoop, I would say. Thank you for having you here, and nice to have you here in the studio. Thank you. You just gave a lecture on the CBDCs and the 2030 agenda. And the COVID idea, which was very interesting. Can you give us a short impression of your lecture?
Yes. Well, I was asked by the organizers to speak on the Great Reset. And of course, you know, the time is limited, so you've got to focus on some core aspects. And from my perspective, despite the fact that, you know, we've had lots of talk about the virus and health measures and so on, I believe that the core of this agenda is a monetary one, and we have to talk about the monetary system. So I gave it the subtitle, The Technocratic Takeover and Its Monetary Core. And so we need to understand the background. I did not expect or predict the COVID events, because I hadn't actually been following what has apparently been going on for a while in the health sector specifically. You know, as an economist, I've been watching banks and banking and economies and markets and so on, and government central bank policies in that. But it seems that it's very closely connected to what's been going on now for decades in the monetary arena. And there's a connection.
Why do they want the central bank digital currencies?
Right, exactly. Actually, what became obvious is that, you know, already in March 2020, when suddenly we had these lockdown policies, which were a really big break in terms of health measures, because in medicine you do not quarantine healthy people. You know, you don't lock up people. That's never been done, and that's not been a public health policy. So that's very unusual. And I also noticed that during that month, some other unusual things happened at the same time, such as several central banks came out and had meetings and reports published about central bank digital currencies.
Did you follow that tendency already?
Of course. Yeah. So, and what I noticed is that now they were really stepping it up, and they were getting much more proactive and public about it.
So you noticed immediately then, at that moment you noticed immediately they are using this event.
Yes, precisely. That was quite obvious. Yeah. Now, I had been warning about this central bank digital currencies since 2015, and in various lectures and articles, 2016 in print. But actually, even before then, it was clear that that direction was where the central planners have been heading, and so, you know, I didn't expect it to be this virus story and various apparently virus-related policies that would become an important component of the implementation of this, but the rest of the agenda was already there. So this central bank digital currency is a long-standing process that the central planners have been aiming at. And so I don't know, perhaps we start just talking about that, and then we can come back to how they've sort of instrumentalized the health policies. So first, I mean, maybe it's important just to define what is this thing, central bank digital currency, and they've chosen a very technical and almost boring term, which is supposed to suggest certain things like, oh, this is a very specific technical thing. Yeah. It's not a big thing or major thing, and it's complicated, technocratic. You know, we don't have to worry about it.
So and that exactly is the moment where the audience should wake up.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they are meant to go to sleep.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a bit like, to give an example, in 2006, I set up a global macro hedge fund for Bear Stearns Asset Management. And the salespeople were not selling my fund, they were not raising money for my fund, although I explained that, look, I make money with this fund by watching and measuring bank and central bank credit creation, which is their true policies, not what they say, which is, the public face is the interest rate policies, but really inside the box what they're doing is quantitative credit policies. And analyzing that's how we're going to internationally allocate the assets, and that's how you get a return in currencies and bonds and equities. That's the idea of this fund, which I set up and headed and was senior managing director, senior portfolio manager at Bear Stearns Asset Management, Bear Stearns Global Alpha Fund. And we had it was a small fund. We just started it, 35 million, something like that under management. But the salespeople were supposed to raise a lot of money and boost the size of the fund, but they weren't doing it. And so I asked them, well, why not? There's too much to explain. There's another fund, in fact, 2 funds that are just flying off the shelves, and then we earn more sales fees. Yeah. Namely, and this is just another example of this technocratic name to suggest that something complicated, technocratic, but sort of boring, safe is happening. This one is called the Bear Stearns Structured Credit Strategies Fund and the Bear Stearns Structured Credit Strategies Enhanced Leverage Fund. Now these funds, I mean, that's pretty long, not exactly catchy names, but sort of technical, boring, probably safe.
Safe, yeah. You trust it immediately.
Yes, and exactly that. I mean, and so why were they flying off the shelves? Because they had a performance that you could draw with a ruler, very straight, no volatility. Not very high, it was below 10% in those days, that was sort of modest performance, but steady, no volatility. And in finance, they tell you risk equals volatility. If something's volatile, it's risky. Yeah. So they were flying off the shelves because all the fund managers and institutional investors in their risk models, this is low risk. And this name, very technocratic, boring, it's fine, let's invest there. Well, it went up performance straight line and then straight to zero.
Really?
Complete, what they call, the technical term in the hedge fund industry is a blow up.
Oh, okay.
And both of them, of course, because the high leverage one had even higher leverage than the other one, which already had high leverage. Yeah. And that's how you get your blow up. Yeah. So it was a trick, basically. Whereas mine, did well and performed, but the investors,
and it
chose the risky one because it had such a boring name.
And it's still going, your fund?
No, sadly, Bear Stearns, when these 2 funds blew up, Bear Stearns blew up the whole company. And it was one of the first. That was in fact 2008, the financial crisis. I started with Bear Stearns in 2007. Then Lehman Brothers came next, and so they also closed my fund.
Terrible.
Despite the fact that it's one of the better performing funds.
Okay.
But it's an example, you see. So why are the central bankers choosing this name? One thing is it suggests that it's something new because we haven't heard central bank digital currency before. So it's something new that they're introducing. That's not true. Do you know that we've been using BDC for many decades? Okay, it's not CBDC, but it's the BDC part of CBDC. Namely, bank digital currencies.
No.
We've been using those. That's what you do.
Okay.
When you get your paycheck, your salary.
Yeah, it's all digital.
Or when you transfer money to somebody, that's digital money. That's the money we have in the bank.
It's uncovered.
And that is bank digital currency. So we have been using digital currency for many decades.
Okay.
It's the banks, it's issued by the banks, and it's served as well. There's no problem with it. So what's new now is the central bank is saying, we want to get into that. We want to get in on the act. And the trouble is because the central bank is the bank regulator. You really got to start wondering, well, hang on, should the regulator now suddenly compete with the regulated? Another name for central bank digital currency in the original idea is retail current accounts at the central bank. That's really what it is. So you've got an account with a bank, maybe a local Dutch bank, and the central bank is saying, actually, you can open an account with the central bank. And that's where you can have your money and do your transfers through the central bank. Now, is that fair competition? Like if the bank regulator is saying...
Usually the central bank is a wholesaler, actually.
Exactly.
And the commercial banks are the retail banks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if the central bank is now saying, we're getting into this, we want to deal with the public, we want to give the public access to us, our balance sheet, and they can have an account with us, that creates some big problems, because it is, to start with, unfair competition. Yeah. It's as if in football the umpire says, I'm getting bored here as umpire.
I will score a goal.
I'm going to join now. I'm going to score some goals. And in fact, by the way, you guys, you're getting all red cards because you're in my way.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, who's going to score most? Clearly the umpire. Yeah. And that's the risk when we have the bank regulators saying, we're going to go into banking. We're going to offer current accounts for the public with us. That's a big break in the system. In fact, it's tearing up the old agreement that is a sort of unwritten agreement between the central bank and the banks, that the central bank will only be wholesale and the banks will deal with the public.
But we are actually living in a system where big money and big government coincides for decades now. So it is already the big money and big government.
What do you call such a system?
It's a system, it's a cartel, it's
when
whatever.
Big company and big government collude. There is a name for that, which is not a nice name.
Okay, but is it just a facade we are looking at, that we are separating commercial banks from the central banks now, because it's already one system. So the CBDCs are not actually changing anything really in the current situation.
Well, they do because with banks, the commercial banks, the retail banks, we have diversity and we have decentralization. Now, of course, it depends on the country. And some countries have only a small number of banks, and therefore they are very concentrated. Like the UK, 5 banks account for most of the deposits, 90%.
Here as well.
But in Germany, there's 1,500 banks.
In America, a lot of banks.
Exactly. In America, there's many small banks, local banks.
4,000 banks.
In Germany, 80% of all banks are not-for-profit local community banks.
Okay.
And that means in such a system, there is local accountability, because the local community banks, they only lend locally, and you can get involved in various ways. Yeah. And you can find out what they're doing, and you can go to their annual meetings and ask questions. And they won't be able to do really extraordinary bad stuff, because there are more real checks and balances. But once an organization gets too large, nobody can supervise them. And that's true for the global big banks. I mean, the regulators have no idea really what's going on. So they just made them systemically relevant, i.e. they will always get bailed out because, they're just already too much ahead, too big and too complicated. The conclusion after the 2008 crisis should really have been, let's make sure we have much more decentralized banking systems with many small banks, because the German banking system, which has the largest number of banks in the whole of Europe by far, also was the most stable one in the 2008 crisis. There was no recession in Germany, no unemployment.
Well, now we have a German bank who's very risky for years already. Deutsche Bank.
Yeah, so the big banks in Germany, they were the same like in any other country, and they did get into trouble in 2008, and some big banks also in Germany disappeared. Dresdner disappeared, and others, Landesbanken disappeared. These are the big banks. They're the same everywhere. But the difference is that in Germany, they only account for 12-13% of bank deposits. Okay. And over 70% of bank deposits are with local community banks. Nice. Savings banks, Sparkassen, and cooperative banks, Volksbanken, People's Banks, Raiffeisenbanken, and so on. And that is a whole different story. And as a result, because they did not lose any money in the financial crisis, and because they're small, they can't do the big speculation.
So you say actually that those small banks will be destroyed by the CBDC system.
So the 2008 crisis showed clearly that if you have many small local community banks, that's sound, that's very stable, it's much more resilient to shocks and crises. In Germany, as a result, there was no recession. When the big banks tightened lending as a result of the crisis, everywhere, including in Germany. In Germany, because the big banks are a small minority, and most banks are small community banks, they increased their lending to small firms. There was no credit crunch. There was no increase in unemployment, no recession. Whereas in all the other countries where you had the big banks dominating, you had a big shock to the system. It's very, very clear. So the conclusion should have been by the policymakers, we've now learned something. We should actually create many small local banks and have a system more like Germany, which in fact many countries had in the past. I mean, the Netherlands had many, many more cooperative banks, Rabobank, agricultural banks, and community banks.
Yeah.
But the central planners always want to centralize.
Yeah.
And so sadly, after 2008, they then introduced new rules to prevent such a crisis. And what were these rules?
Yeah.
Well, the rules were that you have much more regulation, which small banks can't afford, so they have to merge and they disappear.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So the result of the post-2008 banking policies has been that in many countries, including in Germany, many small banks were forced out of business because now the regulatory burdens were so high that it's, essentially they said, okay, we have to merge with another bank. The ECB has been driving this, and actually it's an official policy. They admit that they want to kill banks.
Small banks.
They say that there's too many banks, we're overbanked, we have to reduce the number of banks. Now, this is somebody who worked for Goldman Sachs and then became head of the ECB, said that. Surprise, surprise, he didn't think Goldman Sachs should disappear. Yeah. It is these small local community banks lending to small firms, which are the backbone of the German economy, and the same in Austria, Switzerland, many countries where you still have these local community banks. You really get a thriving economy that's very resilient, and that's where the job creation is. If you give, say, 500,000 euros to a small firm, it will make a big impact, and there will be jobs created. If you give it to a large firm, nothing.
It will disappear in nothing.
Yeah, there's no increase in employment. So this is actually a great factor to have, employment. And also local wealth creation, because there's the other point that banks are special institutions. They're highly regulated, and partly for a good reason, because they have a license to print money. They're actually creating money. So when you get a bank loan, the money for the bank loan is not from existing deposits. It's not transferred from anywhere inside the bank or outside the bank. The money for a new bank loan is newly created out of nothing. Yeah. And therefore, then adds to the money supply. So the banks create money. And that means if we have many small local community banks, it is the communities, the local communities that are...
It's local wealth.
That create money. Yeah. And they will be much more economically resilient and wealthy. And also inequality will be much lower. Whereas in countries where you have small number of very large banks, you get much more inequality, is very clear. Yeah. And the Mittelstand, the medium-sized companies, they will struggle. Like in the UK, they can't get loans.
Yeah, the small and medium-sized enterprises, SME.
Because big banks want to do big deals with big companies.
Yes, right.
So they don't lend to small firms. It's very simple.
Yeah, like big government wants big money.
Big business, works with big business.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. And then in 2014-15, the Bank of International Settlements and the Federal Reserve in America, and I thought BlackRock was involved as well in making this plan for the central bank digital currencies, or is it an older plan?
It's slightly older. I mean, it started really with the introduction of Bitcoin.
Okay.
And there's a Bitcoin white paper. Earlier there were various white papers by the NSA, which is a sort of sister organization to the CIA. And then Bitcoin was actually pushed by some mainstream organizations such as the Financial Times. Very early on, the Reuters and Bloomberg that put out financial quotes would already include Bitcoin prices. And there would be big articles about Bitcoin when it was totally fringe and tiny, nobody knew about it. But then there was more and more, and then some of the large banks, JP Morgan, started to say that, well, we're going to collaborate with people that work with Bitcoin or other similar electronic, distributed ledger, blockchain-related currencies similar to Bitcoin. And then also central banks said, we have to get in on this. And so Bitcoin has served as a sort of excuse for central banks to be able to say, we also need, there's market demand for this now. In fact, this is what Lagarde said, That's why we need to consider now introducing CBDCs, because we have to offer something. When really, as I said, I mean, there's no need. We have digital currency. We've got bank digital currency.
Yeah.
That's worked well. There's and particularly in continental Europe, it's actually the best system in the world. It's very fast transactions. There's almost never an error. I mean, I've been in other countries where you have entire items and systems to handle reconciliation errors and settlement errors and so on.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen in Europe. So it's a very effective system. And so why do we need something? You see, that's where Bitcoin was useful. It's like, we do need something else now, because central banks also need to offer something similar to Bitcoin, which is a very weak argument, really.
Okay, is it somehow related that they might introduce Bitcoin themselves to, in the end, make the argument that they also needed a digital coin?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's it, you see. So,
because the origins of Bitcoin are still it's a black box. Nobody know.
They give you some hints.
Yeah.
For example, I mean, I've said this many years ago. Having lived in Japan for 12 years, I was interested in the fact that the alleged, legendary, or apocryphal founder of Bitcoin is called Satoshi Nakamoto.
Yeah.
Now, I thought, okay, what does that mean, Satoshi Nakamoto? And then there was no such person. There were people saying, is it this person or that person? But nobody really seemed to be the actual Satoshi Nakamoto. But that's the sort of name they used. And it is a Japanese name.
Yeah.
Okay, if it's a Japanese name, well then let's treat it like a Japanese name, which means step one, put it in the order of Japanese names. Now, in all Asian languages, you put the family name first.
Yeah.
So it's Nakamoto Satoshi.
Yeah.
That's step one. Okay. Step two, write it in Japanese. And if we had a board, I'd write it down. So write it in, they actually use Chinese characters for this. Nakamoto is very, very simple. It's Naka, which is also part of the name for China, the center, the central kingdom,
Oh, okay.
And Moto is the second character of Japan, the origin of the sun, the origin. So center, origin. And Satoshi is the Chinese character for wisdom or intelligence. Now, you often use two characters to emphasize one concept, which is how you could read this. So this could mean very central. So center and then moto together is really central, okay? And Satoshi, you can translate as intelligence. So we're really saying this name means central intelligence.
Well, yeah, it's yeah.
Anyway, so I mean, it's clear that
I never heard this. I never read this. So yeah.
Well, you've got to at least have some basic understanding of Japanese and writing these in Japanese. But I think the Secret Service agencies they like to sometimes give hints, because really they'd like to be talked about, but they have to work in secret.
Wow. Yeah, so it came up earlier, and the whole mystery of Bitcoin or of digital coins might be involved as well. But then we came to the COVID-19 event, and how do they want to build up their central bank digital currencies on COVID events?
Yes, so the idea had been by central banks to introduce this, as we said, central bank digital currency. But the one funny thing is that they'd never told us, and by now we've had lots of articles on CBDC, right? But have you ever seen an article or a video or whatever description of what it actually looks like? I mean, with central bank paper money, we know what it looks like, right?
Yeah.
Bank digital currency, we know, and we've used it ourselves. We know what it looks like. But what does central bank digital currency look like? You see, so they never talk about that because people won't actually like the looks of it.
Yeah.
Because it apparently looks, and several central banks apparently, as I heard from my sources, have already fully developed the final stage of CBDC. I mean, it comes in stages, initially likely through your mobile phone, but that's only an intermediate step. And the final stage is, it's small, and it's the size of a grain of rice. Now, why is that?
And that grain of rice is your entire wallet, or?
Yes, it's your digital ID, your wallet, can be your passport, your key. Now, of course, what we found with our debit cards or credit cards is they've already now moved to the system, RFID chips, RFID technology where you just wave the thing, contactless.
Yes,
that is sort of the conditioning us in this direction. That in the future you'll just wave your hand because you've got the microchip implant under your skin, and because and each step there's a rational reason. It's easier just to wave this, isn't it? It's much faster because we always have to wait in the queues as everyone types in their numbers and all that. So just wave it, it's quicker. But the next rationalization would be, but you can lose your card, somebody can steal your card, and then you're just waving, that's kind of risky. Wouldn't it be nice if you couldn't lose it and nobody could steal it? But it's clear that that's it is almost a step too far for a lot of people because it is a violation of human dignity to actually inject something like that under the skin. So that's where you need some more persuasion.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that this concept of universal basic income has been around for around a century, where everyone should get some kind of citizens, payment. But the billionaire elites have so far not liked that. But since 2015, they've all come out. I mean, all the big billionaires and World Economic Forum have come out, this is a good idea, universal basic income. Well, why suddenly now? Because now we have the technology for the microchip implant. And so in 2017, Bill Gates came out and said that universal basic income is a good idea, but it's too early to introduce it. Now, what was still missing? So we had the technology for the microchip implant, but what was missing was the digital ID hadn't been introduced. Now, this is where this whole COVID agenda had become very useful.
So they were really planning this maybe decades ago, and every couple of years they were sitting around the table and having fun with each other. And how do we implement this actually? What can we make up to make the people doing this what we want? And then they just do something.
Well, I mean, this is how it works in economics. You see, most people think economists they are like scientists, where you objectively analyze the data, then as you sort of assemble the data, you organize the data, you see certain patterns. Maybe this happens whenever that happens, so maybe there's a link, and then you test a hypothesis, and then you come to a conclusion. This would be scientific work. That's not how it works in economics. In economics, and I'm talking about mainstream economics, neoclassical economics, and so on. What you do there is you start with your conclusion. What do you want to prove? And of course, what they have been wanting to prove is that markets are efficient and optimal, and government intervention is inefficient, and therefore we should deregulate, liberalize, and privatize. That's the conclusion they've wanted to prove. And then you work backwards. Well, what sort of model will give us this conclusion? And then what sort of assumptions are needed to justify that model? And then present in reverse order. You present your assumptions for sake of argument. Let's assume X, Y, Z, and so on. Then we get this sort of setup. We manipulate it. Oh, surprise, surprise. Here we can show that government intervention is bad and markets should be left on their own. There should be no restrictions on big business. There should be deregulation, liberalization, and we should privatize any national assets.
Which are the things are going on for decades.
So you start with your conclusion, you work backwards, you present it the other way around. And that's been going on for decades in economics. So it stands to reason that, particularly when you're in the business of central planning, you start with your goals. I mean, what do you want to achieve? And then you work backwards, how do we get there? And then what is needed for that? I mean, that is the function of central planning. Of course, it doesn't mean that central planners have to be in charge and necessarily are in charge, but we clearly have some people that love central planning.
Yeah.
It was very popular in the Soviet Union. That was the central planning system, but it's a disaster. It failed. So that's why it's sad to see that so many people, for example, in Europe, seem to love central planning and want to, quite desperate to introduce central planning and giving more and more power to central planners, when really a decentralized system and structure is much more resilient. And because with central planning, you give so much power to a small group of people, even if they're very good people, just human error alone would have much more disastrous consequences in a central planning system. But then also if you have the wrong people being the central planners, not necessarily thinking of the greater good, then of course you will get a lot of disasters for the majority. And that's the trouble. So we have to be very much aware of this reality.
We will. The story is it's very revealing. I would say I learned a lot. I hope we can. I think the CBDC issue will be explored the next month in the alternative media much more, because they want to push it very hard. When is the moment they really like to introduce it as a reality?
Yes,
because it's ready, right?
It is ready.
Yeah,
and so the sequence has been that. First, they worked on the technology. They had what they wanted. It was completely made ready already quite a few years ago.
Okay.
Then the question became, how can we introduce it? And the usual game plan would have been to do what central banks in many countries have been working on for many decades, which is to create boom-bust cycles and economic crises. And then in the crisis, you say, here's a new idea. That's the solution to the crisis. That's how they've been operating. But in this case, it seems they concluded that resistance will still be too high. People don't really want to accept this implant because it could also have consequences. And apparently we learned from the World Economic Forum that there is also an approach in law that once you have, that what they call transhumanism, once you have electronic implants in the body, which is... to persuade people to do that, they always say this will enhance your functions, you get more abilities, like almost become superhuman.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the legal consequence may be that you're not classified as human anymore. There's this movement out there talking about humanoid robots.
Yeah.
And, many years ago I thought, to create a humanoid robot, that's a lot of work in electronics. In order to create this humanoid robot, because when you're starting with electronics, there's a lot to build. But it's much faster if you start with a human.
Yeah.
You see?
Yeah.
So once you have certain implants, you may then be classified as a humanoid robot, which seems to be what these transhumanist people...
You can use them and throw them away whenever you like.
That becomes the next question. So once you're not classified as human anymore, but as humanoid robot, will you have human rights? And World Economic Forum has done surveys asking people, do you think humanoid robots should have human rights? And most people say, no. Well, that could be you, once you've accepted the microchip implant.
Yeah,
Hopefully not.
They signed their death sentence, actually, so, almost. Yeah.
So then the question was how to introduce this. And because clearly there is going to be resistance, they thought, okay, maybe just the simple way of creating an economic crisis is not going to be enough. So we need some other measure, and that's where they work on, gain of function, virus research, and bioweapons comes in, which of course officially forbidden, but we know that particularly America has been against the international treaties, working on that in many laboratories, also in the Ukraine, and.
So to do this whole plan, to make it happening, the medical element is crucial.
Well, it's not my plan, and so it seems they have concluded
the medical
that the
world
medical
has to step
part.
in.
Apparently, they decided they wanted to use the medical health dimension in order to introduce digital IDs.
Exactly, yeah.
Because I suppose they felt that if you scare people enough, So instead of using the crisis sort of stress, use a different form of stress, which is just being scared for your life.
Yeah.
If people are scared enough for their life by just creating this, you know,
They will do anything.
imaginary, lethal threat, then and here's the solution, you know, with this digital health pass, which is a form of digital ID, you will be safe and we can make society safe.
Yeah.
They figured, okay, that's where resistance is least and that's how we can introduce it. And then it's just a small step from the digital ID, which again will be initially, is as we know already, our QR codes on the phone. But from there, we can move further to get some implant under your skin that will then serve as that ID. But why not also have some extra functions? You know, you can have X, Y, Z and digitally enhanced things.
Yeah.
So that seems to be where certainly the World Economic Forum has been pushing, and it's published on their website. You can look up all that. You know, this transhumanist agenda and digital implant agenda, and microchips are just one example of the type of stuff they want to implant.
Yeah, yeah. Meanwhile, that's the reason why they're doing it all. Yeah. Well, it's thrilling. Thank you for this brave story, the research you did. I hope you can enlighten us for a long time, and you can go with telling us about it, because I can imagine that it's not easy to tell this story and keep on the academic work as well.
I mean, it's become easier because more and more people have seen this, and now many people are talking about this. It's become more and more apparent. Of course, it remains important to educate people about what's going on, but I think the way to do it is just to try to be objective, look at the facts, be open-minded, check the facts, be critical always, and make up your own mind on something after having checked the facts and the data. That becomes much more important as they are, pushing various health solutions. Is this really good for you? And everyone should decide for themselves. That's become more important. So the individual, in that sense, should become more empowered, making decisions for themselves, which happens when they're educated about what's going on. So that's an important task, I think.
Yeah. Thank you so much. When you, as a watcher, audience, like to know more, I can personally recommend the Solari report from Catherine Austin Fitz. It's in English. Maybe you have your own recommendations to further reading or watching.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've mentioned my book Princes of the Yen. That's available by quantumpublishers.com.
Nice.
Quantumpublishers.com. It seems, it's very expensive on Amazon,
Okay.
and may not be the original new edition.
Because there is a censored edition.
There's an edition where one chapter is missing.
Very important.
That was the chapter warning of the global financial crisis. Yeah.
Mr. Werner, thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Thanks.
Thank you for watching. You can watch the other videos from the International Science Summit as well. A lot of interesting speakers and very interesting lectures. So you can watch the lectures themselves and also the interviews with the speakers.
Deze video is mogelijk gemaakt door